The wind came first, a low moan through the pines that sounded like a dying animal. Then the sky, which had been a hard, unforgiving slate gray all day, began to weep. Not rain, not sleet, but a fine, dry powder of snow that swirled and danced on the currents of the rising gale. By dusk, the world outside Clara's small cabin was a churning whiteness, a void that had swallowed the mountains, the town, and the very idea of a horizon. Inside, the wind found every crack in the chinking, every loose board in the floor. It was a physical presence, a cold hand that slid along her neck and pressed against the small of her back. Clara sat hunched on a low stool before the stone hearth, feeding the fire stick by precious stick. Each piece of pine was a calculation. A minute of warmth now against an hour of shivering later. Her stack of kindling, gathered over weeks of nervous foraging, had dwindled to a pathetic mound in the corner, barely enough to see her through another day, let alone a blizzard that the old-timers would speak of for years. The cabin was her husband's. Thomas had built it with his own 2 hands, his pride swelling with every log he had notched and set. He had promised her a life here, away from the grimy eastern cities, a place where a man's sweat and determination were the only currency that mattered. He had been wrong. In the small mining town of Prospect's Hope, there were other currencies: gold dust, whiskey, and the long, unforgiving memory of dead. It had been 4 months since they buried him. The ground had been hard then, too, but not yet frozen solid. She remembered the scrape of the shovels against rock and clay, a sound that had echoed the scraping hollowness inside her own chest. Thomas had died in a dispute over a card game, over a debt he swore he did not owe. A flash of anger, a clumsy draw, and a bullet had torn through the life he had promised her. The man who had fired the shot, a burly miner with a claim that was petering out, had walked free. It was ruled a matter of self-preservation, a defense against a desperate, ruined man. And the ruin, the town decided, was her fault. The whispers followed her like a shadow whenever she dared to walk the single muddy street into town for supplies. They said she had pushed him, that her desire for pretty things, a calico dress, a tin of peaches from St. Louis, had driven him to gamble away what little they had. They saw the weariness in her young face and called it ambition. They saw her grief and called it a performance. She was the woman who had driven her husband to ruin, a cautionary tale told by mothers to their daughters, a piece of unfortunate property to be dealt with. The cabin, once a symbol of hope, had become her prison. The weight of the snow on the roof felt like the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her. Her supplies were a testament to her isolation. A handful of flour, half a sack of dried beans, some salted pork that was more salt than pork, and a small tin of coffee grounds she reused until the brew was little more than brownish water. Loneliness was a constant ache, but starvation was becoming a real and terrifying possibility. A sharp rap on the door made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one ever came to her door. The sound was alien, intrusive. She clutched the iron poker from the hearth, its familiar weight a small comfort, and moved silently to the door. "Clara May," a man's voice called out, muffled by the door and the storm. "It is Reverend Miller. Open the door, child. The Lord's work cannot wait for the weather." Her shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and dread. She slid the heavy wooden bar from its hasps and pulled the door inward. A blast of wind and snow drove into the room, making the fire dance wildly. Reverend Miller stood on her threshold, a mountain of a man wrapped in a thick wool coat, his beard and eyebrows crusted with ice. "Good heavens, child, you will catch your death," he said, stepping inside and stamping the snow from his boots. He pushed the door closed against the storm's fury, sealing them in the dim, smoky air of the cabin. "The Lord has laid a heavy burden on you, but he does not abandon his flock." Clara said nothing, merely retreating to the hearth. She did not feel like part of any flock. She felt like a lone sheep, left for the wolves. The preacher warmed his hands by the fire, his gaze sweeping over the sparse cabin, taking in the low supplies, the threadbare blanket on her small cot, the palpable sense of despair that clung to the very walls. His face, usually set in lines of stern piety, softened with something that looked almost like pity. "I have come with a proposition," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "An answer to your prayers." Clara doubted he knew the content of her prayers. They were not for salvation, but for silence, for a world where she did not have to hear the whispers or feel the accusing stares. "Mr. Thorne was at services Sunday," the Reverend continued. "A good, God-fearing man, a man of property. He has noticed your plight. He has authorized me to make you an offer on his behalf." Clara's stomach tightened. Josiah Thorne was the cruel rancher whose land bordered the small plot Thomas had bought. He was a man with a hard mouth and eyes that lingered too long, eyes that stripped a woman down to her use and value. He had wanted this plot of land for its access to the creek, while Thomas was alive. Thorne had made sneering offers, trying to bully them out. Now, it seemed, he had found an easier way. "He offers you his hand in marriage," Reverend Miller declared, as if presenting a divine gift. "He will take on your late husband's debts. You would be mistress of a fine ranch, with a full larder and a warm house. You would be safe." The word safe landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Safe from the cold, perhaps safe from hunger. But she had seen the way Thorne handled his horses, with a hard hand and a short temper. She had heard stories of his first wife, a timid woman who had withered away until she was little more than a ghost in her own home. Being given away to Josiah Thorne felt less like salvation and more like a different kind of grave. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm. The Reverend frowned. "Clara, you must be sensible. This is a blessing. What other prospects do you have? You cannot survive the winter alone. It is not proper. Mr. Thorne is a powerful man. His offer is more than generous." "My husband is barely cold in the ground," she whispered, staring into the flames. "Your husband is with the Lord," the preacher countered, his voice losing its gentle edge. "Your duty now is to the living, to yourself. Do not let pride lead you to ruin, as it did him." The barb struck home, sharp and cruel. She flinched as if he had slapped her. He saw it, but his expression did not soften. He believed he was saving her soul, even if it meant breaking her spirit. "Think on it, child," he said, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "Mr. Thorne will expect an answer by the end of the week. Pray for wisdom." He opened the door and was gone, leaving behind a swirl of snow and the chill of his ultimatum. She was not property to be bartered. She would not be given away. She would rather face the storm, the hunger, the freezing dark, than place her hand in Josiah Thorne's. The fire was dying. Her decision, rash as it was, had given her a sliver of resolve. She would not sit here and wait for Thorne's deadline. She would fight, and right now, fighting meant finding more wood. Pulling on Thomas's old coat, which hung on her small frame like a shroud, and wrapping a worn wool scarf around her head and face, she grabbed the small hand sled and a woodsman's axe. The wind nearly tore the door from her hand as she stepped out into the maelstrom. The snow was already past her ankles, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. The world was a blinding, howling chaos. She kept her head down, leaning into the wind, her eyes slitted against the stinging snow. The woods behind the cabin were only 100 yards away, but it felt like a mile. Every step was a struggle. The familiar shapes of the pines were ghostly apparitions, their branches heavy with snow. She focused on the small things, the crunch of her boots, the ache in her lungs, the desperate need for firewood. She found a fallen pine limb, half buried in a drift, and began to work at it with the axe. The blows were clumsy, her hands already numb inside her thin mittens. The axe thudded into the frozen wood. sending up small chips. It was slow, exhausting work. After hacking off several manageable pieces, she loaded them onto the sled, her body trembling with exertion. It was not much, but it was enough for another night. As she turned to go, something caught her eye, a dark shape against the white, nestled at the base of a thick cluster of firs, sheltered slightly from the worst of the wind. At first, she thought it was a boulder or a fallen log she had missed, but it was too regular, too soft-looking. Curiosity, a feeling she had not felt in months, pricked at her. She waded through the deepening snow, the sled dragging behind her. As she got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a great wolf hide, its gray and black fur dusted with a thick layer of white. It was draped over a mound. Perhaps a hunter had dropped his kill. She reached out a hesitant hand and brushed the snow from the hide. Beneath it was not the carcass of an animal, but the shape of a man. He was lying on his side, curled in on himself, half buried in the snow that had drifted around him. His face was turned away from her, and he was unnervingly still. A cowboy, by the looks of his worn leather chaps and sturdy boots. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knelt, her knees sinking into the powder. "Sir," she called out, her voice thin against the roar of the wind. "Mister?" There was no response. His stillness was absolute, the stillness of death. She had seen it before, on Thomas. A final, settled peace that was more terrifying than any struggle. Pity and fear warred within her. Another soul lost to the unforgiving wilderness. She should leave him, go back to the relative warmth of her cabin. There was nothing to be done. But she could not. Some instinct, some lingering piece of the woman she had been before grief had hollowed her out, compelled her to act. She reached forward, her fingers clumsy with cold, and brushed the snow from his cheek. His skin was like ice. His stubble was flecked with frost. His lips a pale, bluish gray. He was gone. She was about to pull her hand away when she felt it, or perhaps she imagined it. A flicker of warmth, a faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall against her fingertips, which she had pressed against the side of his mouth. She held her breath, pressing harder. There it was again, a shallow, ghostly puff of air, so faint it was more a memory of breath than the real thing. He was alive. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. A living man was freezing to death just yards from her home. Every rational thought told her to run. She had no food, no medicine. She could barely save herself. Taking him in would be a death sentence for them both. It was madness. It was suicide. He was a stranger. For all she knew, he was a bandit, an outlaw. Bringing him into her home was a danger she could not afford. She stood up, turning her back on him. She took 2 steps toward her cabin, the image of her dwindling supplies clear in her mind. Then she stopped, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She thought of Reverend Miller's words, of Josiah Thorne's possessive eyes. She thought of the whispers in town and the profound, crushing loneliness of her nights. This man, this stranger, was a problem. But he was a human problem, a life flickering in the dark. Leaving him here to die felt like a surrender, a final admission that the town was right, that she was a cold, selfish woman who had let her own husband perish. A low sob escaped her lips, instantly frozen in the air. Against all reason, against every instinct for self-preservation, she turned back. Dragging him was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, heavy with muscle and frozen clothing. She heaved and pulled, her boots slipping in the snow. She managed to roll him onto the small sled, his long legs dangling off the end. The wolf hide came with him, a grim, frozen cloak. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal, desperate fight against the storm. The wind screamed in her ears, trying to push her back. The sled runners caught on buried roots and rocks. She fell to her knees twice, her face pressed into the biting snow, the taste of ice and earth in her mouth. Each time, she got up gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest, and pulled again. She fixed her eyes on the hazy outline of her cabin, a faint smudge of gray against the white, and pulled for it as if pulling for her own life. Finally, she stumbled through the doorway, dragging the sled and its frozen cargo inside. She collapsed against the closed door, her body shaking uncontrollably, her lungs burning. The relative quiet of the cabin was dizzying. For a long moment, she could do nothing but lie there, listening to the storm and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The man lay on the floor, an inert lump of ice and leather. The reality of what she had done crashed down upon her. She had brought death into her house to warm it. The fire was nearly out, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cabin feel even colder. She crawled to the hearth and added 2 precious logs to the embers, coaxing them back to life. As the flames grew, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the room, she looked at the stranger. Now, she hesitated. To save him meant committing her resources, her food, her firewood, her own slim chance of survival. Was the life of a stranger worth more than her own? The question was stark and ugly. She looked at his face, now visible in the firelight. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not much older than her own 20 years. His face was lean, darkened by sun and wind, but his features were fine. Despite the bruises and the deathly pallor, a dark lock of hair had fallen across his forehead. He looked less like a threat and more like someone's son, someone's brother. Her conscience, a voice she thought had been buried with Thomas, won the battle. She could not let him die on her floor. Getting his frozen clothes off was an ordeal. The leather of his coat was as stiff as wood. His shirt was frozen to the skin of his chest and shoulders. She had to work carefully, her numb fingers fumbling with buttons and buckles, piece by piece. She removed the layers, the coat, a thick wool shirt, the worn denim trousers. His body was a landscape of lean muscle, old scars, and fresh, angry bruises. A dark, ugly wound on his left shoulder had bled through his shirt, the blood frozen into a stiff, dark patch. He was so cold. Touching his skin was like touching stone. She worked with a grim, methodical purpose, averting her eyes from his nakedness, focusing only on the task. She wrapped him in every spare blanket she owned, piling Thomas's old furs on top of him, until he was cocooned in a mound of wool and hide. Lastly, she draped the great wolf's hide over the top of it all. She knelt beside him, her work done. There was nothing more she could do but wait and feed the fire. The cabin was warmer now, the storm a dull roar outside the snow-caked windows. The firelight flickered, making the shadows dance. In the quiet, she could hear the faint, shallow whisper of his breath. She leaned closer, placing her fingers just before his lips. She felt it again, that fragile puff of air, a tiny pocket of warmth in a world of absolute cold. She did not pull her hand away. "You must live," she whispered into the silence, the words a prayer directed at him, at God, at the storm, at whatever forces governed life and death in this hard land. "You have to—" The firelight cast a warm glow on her face. The snow battered the windows, a relentless assault, and as she knelt there, feeling the faint stir of his breath warming her frozen fingers, a tremor ran through her. It was not from the cold that still clung to her bones, nor from the fear of what the morning would bring. It was something deeper, something she had not felt since the day they lowered her husband into the ground. It was the terrifying, fragile, and undeniable feeling of life returning to her world. He awoke to a world of pain and shadow. For a long moment, he did not know who he was or where his body ended, and the suffocating darkness began. A fire burned in his shoulder, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to have its own heartbeat. His head felt thick, as if stuffed with wet wool. He tried to move, but a great weight pressed him down, a smothering anchor of furs and blankets. Slowly, his senses returned. bringing with them the raw data of his survival. The smell of wood smoke, sharp and resinous. The faint, clean scent of wild herbs, something like yarrow. The sound of a furious wind howling outside, a distant, lonely cry that made the small space around him feel like the center of a storm. He blinked, and the shadows began to take shape. He was lying on a rough plank floor, close to a stone hearth where a small fire crackled, its light casting a weak, golden glow on a low ceiling of heavy logs. A figure moved in the periphery. A woman. She was a silhouette against the flames, her movements quiet and deliberate. She stirred a small pot that hung over the fire. The metallic scrape of a spoon against iron, the only sound besides the wind and the crackling wood. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, and only a dry croak emerged. The sound was enough. The woman turned, and for the first time, he saw her face in the firelight. It was a young face, too young for the deep weariness that had settled in her eyes. Her features were fine, but stark, as if hardship had chiseled away anything soft or superfluous. Her brown hair was pulled back tightly, emphasizing the sharp line of her jaw. She looked at him not with pity or curiosity, but with a flat, guarded expression that gave nothing away. She came to him, carrying a tin cup of water. Without a word, she knelt and gently lifted his head, holding the cup to his cracked lips. The water was blessedly cold, and he drank greedily, the simple act sending a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder. He fell back against the furs, breathing heavily. He could see now that a crude bandage had been wrapped around his shoulder and chest. It was clean, and the herbal smell came from a poultice he could feel beneath the cloth. Someone had saved him. This woman. "Where?" he rasped, his voice still a stranger to him. "Where am I?" She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the fire, as if his question were of no more consequence than a shifting ember. She stood, her movements economical and graceful, and returned to the pot. After a long silence, she answered, her voice as low and devoid of warmth as the winter landscape outside. "Know where anyone comes back from—" The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He did not know if she meant the blizzard, the mountains, or this small, isolated cabin. Looking at the emptiness in her eyes, he suspected she meant all three. He tried to remember how he had gotten here. There were flashes, disjointed and violent, the thunder of a gunshot, not his own, the desperate flight on his horse, a name, Walter, on his lips, the world tilting, the snow rising up to meet him, and then a profound, numbing cold that had promised peace, the wolf hide. He remembered pulling it from his saddle roll, a last, desperate act against the encroaching frost. After that, there was only darkness. His name was Eli. He held on to that fact like a single solid object in a swirling vortex of confusion. Eli. He was a ranch hand. He was in trouble. He closed his eyes, the effort of thought too draining. Sleep, thick and dreamless, pulled him back under. The days that followed fell into a slow, silent rhythm, dictated by the storm outside and the quiet woman inside. The blizzard did not break. It raged against the small cabin, piling snow against the door and windows until the world was reduced to this single, firelit room. Clara, as he learned her name was when he saw it stitched into a sampler on the wall, moved with a ghost-like quietness. She tended to his wound, changing the herbal dressing with impersonal efficiency. She fed him a thin, watery broth made from salted pork and dried beans, a meal that spoke of scarcity and careful rationing. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in short, clipped sentences. "Drink this. You must stay still. The fire needs more wood." She avoided his eyes, her focus always on the task at hand, as if looking at him directly would be to acknowledge a reality too complicated to bear. Eli, for his part, healed with the stubborn resilience of a man who had spent his life in a hard country. The fever broke on the third day. leaving him weak but clear-headed. By the 5th day, he could sit up on his own, the furs pooled around his waist. He watched her, trying to piece together the story of this solemn woman who had dragged him from the edge of death only to treat him like a piece of inconvenient furniture. He saw the way she measured out the flour for their daily, meager ration of bread, her movements precise and worried. He saw the worn patches on her dress, mended with tiny, neat stitches. He saw that she ate even less than he did, her own bowl of broth always shallower than the one she gave him. He noticed the absence of another person's belongings. The cabin was stark, clean, and inhabited by a loneliness so profound it felt like a permanent chill in the air. Once he was strong enough to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He felt the uselessness of his position keenly. He was a burden, another mouth to feed in a home that was clearly starving. One morning, he watched her struggle to split a large log inside the cabin, her blows with a small axe lacking the force to make a clean break. "Let me," he said, his voice stronger now. She stopped, startled, and looked at him. It was one of the few times their eyes met directly. Hers were the color of a winter sky, gray and distant. "You are not well enough." "I am well enough to split a log," he insisted. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the sharp protest from his shoulder, and took the axe from her hand. Her fingers were cold as they brushed against his. The log was stubborn, but he found the grain, and with 2 sharp, well-aimed blows, it split cleanly in 2. He worked through the rest of the small pile, the familiar rhythm of the work, a comfort, a small act of repaying an unpayable debt. After that, an uneasy truce formed between them. She would cook their sparse meals in silence, and he would tend the fire and chop the wood, his strength slowly returning. They were 2 strangers trapped in a space no bigger than a horse stall, sharing a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. He learned more from what she did not do than from anything she said. One afternoon, the wind died down for a brief spell, and in the sudden quiet, they heard the sound of horses and men's voices from the road that ran past the cabin, a road buried under feet of snow, but still a known path. Eli, conditioned by weeks on the run, felt a jolt of alarm, but it was Clara's reaction that held him captive. She did not run to the window. Instead, she shrank back from it, moving into the darkest corner of the cabin, her body rigid, her face a pale mask of fear. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and she held her breath until the sounds faded into the distance. He saw it then, the terror that lived just beneath her calm, composed surface. It was a deep, abiding fear, the kind that settles into a person's bones. He had seen it in spooked horses and cornered animals. He had not expected to see it in the woman who had single-handedly fought a blizzard to save his life. The silence that followed was different, heavier. The unspoken questions had been joined by an unspoken understanding. They were both hiding from something. That evening, as she ladled out their broth, he decided to break the silence. "You act like you are the one with a price on your head," he said quietly, his eyes on the fire. She froze, the ladle hovering over his bowl. She did not answer, but he felt her gaze on him. "There is a price on mine," he continued, the confession costing him more than he expected. "I am a ranch hand, or I was. From the Cross Creek spread. Over in the next valley, I am accused of shooting my boss." He finally looked at her. The fear was back in her eyes, sharp and immediate. Her hand trembled, and a drop of broth fell onto the floor. "I did not do it," he said quickly, his voice low and earnest. "I swear on my mother's grave, I never shot him." She searched his face, her gray eyes narrowed, looking for the lie. He met her gaze without flinching, letting her see the truth of his words, the desperation. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased, though the fear remained. She finished filling his bowl and handed it to him, her fingers brushing his again. This time, he noticed she pulled her hand back as if burned. She did not ask for more of the story. and he did not offer it. But a piece of the wall between them had been chipped away. He was no longer just a nameless stranger. He was Eli, a wanted man who swore he was innocent. His belongings, which she had piled in a corner, consisted of little more than his saddlebags and the wolf hide. He had seen her glance at the bags several times, a flicker of curiosity in her otherwise impassive face. He knew what was inside: a change of clothes, a small pouch of coffee, a half-eaten strip of jerky, and his Colt revolver, wrapped in an oilcloth. The gun was his biggest secret, the damning evidence that would hang him if he were ever caught. A few nights later, the storm returned with a new, vicious fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the cold deepened, seeping through the walls until their breath plumed in the air even inches from the fire. They had run out of the wood Eli had chopped, and the kindling pile was nearly gone. The fire was a pathetic circle of embers, fighting a losing battle against the invasive chill. Clara was restless, her usual composure frayed. She was rummaging through his saddlebags, her back to him. He assumed she was looking for something, anything, to burn. Then she went still. He saw her shoulders stiffen. She slowly pulled her hand from the bag. In it, she held the revolver, its dark metal gleaming dully in the faint light from the dying fire. She turned to face him, the gun held loosely in her hand, not as a weapon, but as an accusation. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Terror was paramount, tightening her lips and widening her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a tremor of something else, a desperate, consuming curiosity. The gun was the physical proof of the violence that haunted him, and it terrified her. Yet she did not drop it. She did not scream. She stood there, trembling, waiting. "You said you did not shoot him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I did not," Eli said, his heart sinking. He had to make her understand. He could not lose this fragile sanctuary. "Clara, look at me." She raised her eyes from the gun to his face. "I told you the truth. I never fired the shot that killed my boss, Mr. Hemlock." He took a slow breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. "But I know who did." He paused, gathering the words, the memory he had pushed down for weeks. It was his own son, Walter, a boy of 17, all hot-headed and useless. Hemlock was a hard man, cruel. He was beating the boy something fierce with a belt in the stable. I stepped in. I told him to stop. Hemlock turned on me, pulled his gun. Walter, the boy, panicked. He had a little pistol he was always showing off. He pulled it and fired. It was a wild shot, never meant to kill, but it struck his father in the chest. Eli looked down at his hands. Walter just fell apart, crying, screaming. He would have hung for it. He is not built for that. He is soft. I knew what they would do to him. I took the boy's gun, and I gave him mine. I told him to ride east and never look back, to tell everyone I had a fight with his father and shot him. I fired a round from my own Colt into the stable wall, so the sheriff would find the right bullet. Then I ran. He looked back up at her. She was still standing there, the gun in her hand, her expression unreadable. I took the blame to protect him, he finished quietly. That is the truth of it. The cabin was silent save for the howl of the wind. Clara stared at him for a long time, the firelight reflecting in her wide, searching eyes. She looked from his face to the heavy revolver in her hand, then back again, slowly, deliberately. She walked over and placed the gun on the floor next to his saddlebags. She did not say a word, but he knew, in that moment, that she believed him. The act of confession, of sharing the weight of his secret, had forged a new, deeper connection between them. But the cold was their more immediate enemy. The fire was little more than a handful of glowing coals. They huddled near it, wrapped in every blanket they owned. But the chill was relentless, seeping into their bones, making their teeth chatter. Clara was shivering violently, her face pale and pinched. He saw her staring at the great wolf hide, the one he had been found under, which she now used as a final layer over her own thin blankets at night. It was large enough for two people. The thought was there, unspoken, hanging between them in the frigid air. To share a bed, even a pallet on the floor, was a line they had not crossed. For him, it was a matter of respect for her privacy, for her unspoken grief. For her, he could only guess it was a barrier she had erected against the world, against men. But the cold was making a mockery of such boundaries. Survival was a more primal need than propriety. He watched as she wrestled with the decision, her jaw tight. He could see the fear and hesitation in her eyes, a deep-seated reluctance that seemed to go beyond simple modesty. Finally, her shivering grew too violent to ignore. She looked at him, her eyes dark with a mixture of desperation and something that looked like shame. She unfolded the heavy wolf hide and spread it out closer to the dying embers. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the wind, a fragile thread of sound that was frayed and broken. "I'll warm you, if you let me." It was not a seduction. It was a plea, a bargain with the encroaching death that was the cold. She was not just offering warmth, she was asking for it. And in her words, "If you let me," she was giving him the choice, preserving a sliver of her own agency in an act of pure necessity. He could only nod, his own body too stiff with cold to do more. She hesitated for another moment, then lay down on the furs, her back to him. He moved after her, settling beside her, pulling the heavy, fur-lined hide over both of them. It created a small pocket of shared space, a fragile shelter against the vast, freezing night. Through the layers of their clothes and the blankets wrapped around them, he could feel the trembling of her body. He could feel the slightness of her frame, the rigid set of her shoulders. They lay there for a long time, two separate islands of misery under a single hide, but slowly, miraculously, the simple physics of shared heat began to work. The bitter edge of the cold began to recede. The violent shivering subsided into a gentle tremor. He could feel the warmth of her back seeping through to his chest. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing. A little more even now, the tension between them, born of guilt and secrets and the raw intimacy of their situation, did not vanish, but it changed. Desire was not the right word for what he felt. It was something quieter, more fundamental. It was a profound awareness of the life beside him, a life as fragile and as stubborn as his own. They did not speak again. There were no words for the complex emotions that filled the small, warm space beneath the wolf's hide. There was only the sound of the blizzard raging outside and the two heartbeats within, slowly finding a shared rhythm in the dark. The ice that had encased both their hearts for so long had not melted, but for the first time, deep beneath the surface, something had begun to thaw. The morning broke in a deafening silence. The blizzard had blown itself out, leaving behind a world remade in white and blue. Sunlight, brilliant and cold, streamed through the cabin's single window, striking diamond dust from the frost on the glass. Outside, the valley was a pristine bowl of glittering snow, the pines heavy laden, their branches drooping under the immense, silent weight. The world felt clean, scoured, as if the storm had washed away all the ugliness and noise. It was a beautiful lie. Inside the cabin, the peace was just as fragile. The shared warmth from the night had lingered, a small, unspoken truce against the morning chill. When Clara awoke, Eli was already awake, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. They had shifted apart in their sleep, but the memory of his closeness, of the steady rhythm of his breathing in the dark, remained. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire she now needed to build. They moved around each other with a new, careful awareness. The rigid lines of stranger and savior had blurred. His confession and her silent acceptance of it had changed the air between them. He was Eli, a man who had sacrificed his freedom for a boy's mistake. She was Clara, a woman who had saved him. They were bound by the secrets they now kept for each other. But their larder was bare. The last of the beans had gone into yesterday's broth. The salted pork was a memory. The only thing left was a dusting of flour at the bottom of the sack. The new, silent world outside was not a haven. It was a threat. The snow that looked so beautiful would make travel impossible for some. But for men who knew how to read it, it was a ledger, recording every track, every stumble, every drop of blood. "I have to go to town," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. Eli sat up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. He had watched her for days, had seen the fear that the mere sound of passing riders could evoke. "It is not safe," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "We are out of food," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Hunger is not safe either." She wrapped herself in Thomas's old coat, the garment a constant, heavy reminder of her past. She pulled on thick wool socks and her worn leather boots. Before she left, Eli stopped her, his good hand resting for a bare second on her arm. His touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through her. "Be careful, Clara," he said, his voice low. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a genuine concern that felt both foreign and deeply comforting. "I will," she promised, and slipped out the door, leaving him alone in the borrowed silence of her cabin. The walk to Prospect's Hope was arduous. The snow was waist-deep in places, and she had to follow the line of the buried road by memory, guided by the tallest pines that flanked it. The sun on the snow was blinding, and the cold was a sharp, clean ache in her lungs. By the time she saw the first plume of smoke rising from the town's chimneys, she was exhausted, her legs trembling with the effort. The town felt different, energized by the end of the storm. Men were out in the street, shoveling pathways, their voices loud and hearty in the crisp air. She kept her head down, pulling her scarf tighter around her face, and made her way to Miller's Mercantile, the only store in town. The store was crowded, a hub of warmth and noise and the rich smell of coffee, cured leather, and damp wool. Men in heavy coats and fur hats were gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, their laughter booming in the enclosed space. She tried to make herself invisible, moving quietly to the counter at the back, waiting for old Mr. Miller to notice her. It was here, in the shadows, that the words found her. "Josiah Thorne is putting up $50 of his own," a big miner with a red beard was saying, his voice full of avarice. "On top of the reward from the Hemlock estate, all for the hide of that cowboy." Clara's blood went cold. She stood perfectly still, her back to the men, pretending to examine a row of canned peaches. $50? Another man whistled. "For a wounded man, he cannot have gotten far in that blizzard, especially not bleeding like he was. Jedediah says he followed the blood trail from the road right up to the edge of the woods behind the widow's cabin," the red-bearded man continued, and Clara felt her heart stop. Trail went cold there with the new snow, but that is where he was heading. Jed figures he is holed up in those woods, or maybe froze to death by now. "Come morning, this new snow will have a crust," a third voice chimed in, belonging to a wiry man she recognized as one of Thorne's ranch hands. "We will be able to track him proper then. A dog could follow that trail. We will find where he went to ground. $50 will buy a lot of whiskey." The men laughed, the sound ugly and predatory. Clara felt faint, the tins on the shelf blurring before her eyes. They knew he was near her cabin. The blood trail. She had been so desperate, so focused on getting him out of the cold, that she had not even thought of the trail he must have left. The blizzard had covered it. But now, the hunt was on. She fumbled in her pocket for the few coins she had, her fingers numb. She bought a small sack of flour and a slab of bacon from a distracted Mr. Miller, her mind racing. She had to warn Eli. Her journey back was a frantic, stumbling flight. The fear that had been her constant companion for months had a new, sharp edge. It was no longer a vague dread, but a specific and immediate terror. She saw them in her mind's eye. Josiah Thorne, his cruel mouth smiling, his men with their guns and their dogs, sweeping through the woods. She saw them finding the cabin, finding Eli. Part of her, a cold, practical voice of self-preservation, whispered that she should let it happen. She could feign ignorance. They would take him away, and her problem would be gone. She would be safe, but the word safe once again tasted like ash in her mouth. Safe, and handed back to Josiah Thorne like a stray piece of livestock. No, she could not do it. She would not. In the silence of the cabin, she and Eli had forged something more than a partnership of convenience. He had trusted her with his life, with his story. Leaving him to the wolves now would be the worst kind of betrayal. It would be an act of cruelty that would make her no better than the gossips in town, no better than Thorne himself. She burst through the cabin door, breathless, her face wild. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his expression hardening as he saw the terror in her eyes. "They know," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe, her lungs heaving. "There is a bounty. They found your blood in the snow. They are coming in the morning to track you." He did not waste a second on questions or disbelief. His fugitive's instincts took over immediately. He moved to his saddlebags, his face a grim mask of resignation. He was already pulling on his frozen, stiffened coat, his movements economical and swift. He was preparing to run, to disappear back into the wilderness that had almost claimed him. He was going to leave. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. He would run, and she would be left here alone, to face Thorne and the town and the crushing weight of her solitude. They would find his tracks leaving her cabin, and they would ask questions she could not answer. Her life would be forfeit, one way or another. He turned to her, his face etched with a weary sorrow. "Thank you, Clara, for everything. I will not bring them to your door." He was at the threshold when he saw the tears streaming down her face. He stopped. He had seen her stoic, seen her afraid, seen her exhausted. He had never seen her cry. The sight of her silent, desperate tears seemed to undo him in a way no threat of violence ever could. "They'll hang you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The words were not just about him. They were about the end of the fragile world they had built in this cabin. "And when they are done with you, they will take me back to the man who owns this land. They will give me to him." Their fates were entwined. She saw it in his eyes as the realization dawned on him. His fight was now her fight. Her prison was now his. He could not run without abandoning her to a fate she clearly feared more than death. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the tree line of the mountain that rose up behind the cabin. "There is an old trapper's line high up on this mountain," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My father used to work it. There are shacks up there, hiding spots. If we move now, we can get a head start before they can track us in the morning sun." He said we. The word was a lifeline. They fled with only what they could carry. Eli took his saddlebags, the revolver now tucked securely inside, and the wolf hide. Clara packed the flour and bacon she had just bought, a tinderbox, and her sharpest knife. They left the cabin door slightly ajar, a silent, empty home that would soon be discovered. Their climb up the mountain was brutal. They avoided the open spaces, sticking to the dense clusters of pine and fir, the snow deep and powdery beneath the trees. Eli led the way, his long legs punching a path through the drifts, his wound a dull fire in his shoulder. Clara followed in his footsteps, her own smaller boots sinking deep into the track he made, her mind a numb buzz of fear and adrenaline. The trapper's shack was little more than a ruin, a small, one-room hovel built into the side of a rocky outcrop. Its roof sagged, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the log walls. But it was hidden, and it was shelter. Inside, they found a crumbling stone fireplace, a crude wooden bunk, and, miraculously, a small pile of dry, forgotten firewood. An old trapper had also left behind a tin of salt and a side of dried venison, hard as a board, hanging from a rafter. It was a gift from a ghost, a promise of a few more days of life. They lived in that cold, cramped space as the days bled into one another. Their world shrank to the size of the shack, their existence pared down to its most essential elements. Fire, food, water melted from the snow, and the shared, silent company of each other. The threat from the valley below was a constant, unspoken presence. But up here, in the high, thin air, they were ghosts. Eli's shoulder began to heal properly. The clean air and enforced rest worked their slow magic. The color returned to his face, and the lines of pain around his eyes softened. He was quiet, but his presence was a steadying force. He never complained. He did his share of the work, his movements becoming surer and stronger each day. But as his physical wounds closed, Clara's hidden ones began to break open, in the relative safety of their isolation, with no town to fear and no immediate crisis to manage. The walls she had built around her memories began to crumble. The nights became a landscape of terror. In her dreams, she was back in her cabin. But it was not Eli who shared the firelight with her. It was Thomas. She would see his face flushed with whiskey, his eyes holding the mean, unpredictable glint she had come to dread. She would hear his voice, not the charming one he used in town, but the low, slurred one he saved for her, the one that accused and belittled. She would feel the weight of his hand, not gentle, but hard and possessive. The memories were fragmented, nightmarish loops of slammed doors, broken crockery, and the sharp, stinging pain of a carelessly thrown blow. She would wake up with a gasp, her heart pounding, the smell of stale whiskey sharp in her nostrils, her body slick with a cold sweat. One night, the dream was worse than usual. She was trapped, her back against a wall, Thomas's face looming over her, his voice a venomous whisper. She screamed in her sleep, a raw, terrified sound that tore through the silence of the shack. She woke up thrashing, her own scream still echoing in her ears. A hand was on her arm, gentle but firm, in the disoriented terror between sleep and waking. It was not Eli's hand, it was Thomas's. He had found her. "No!" she shrieked, striking out, fighting against the touch. "Get away from me! Do not touch me!" Clara, it is me. It is Eli. You are safe." His voice cut through the panic, a calm anchor in the storm of her fear. She stopped struggling, her breath coming in ragged, hiccuping sobs. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the faint, red glow, she could just make out his face above her, etched with concern. He was kneeling beside her bunk, his hand still on her arm. She snatched her arm away as if his touch were fire, scrambling to the far corner of the bunk, pulling a thin blanket up to her chin. He did not move closer. He simply retreated, holding his hands up where she could see them, as if to show they were empty, that they meant no harm. "I am sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I did not mean to frighten you. You were dreaming." She was trembling, the phantom pains and old fears still coursing through her. She looked at him, a man who had only ever shown her kindness, and saw the ghost of one who had not. He saw the terror that remained in her eyes. "I will not touch you," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "Not ever, unless you wish it. You have my word." His promise was a balm on a wound she had not known was still so raw. Thomas had never asked. He had only ever taken. Eli's words gave her back a piece of herself she thought had been destroyed forever. The trembling slowly subsided. Her gaze fell to his chest. In his haste to calm her, he had not pulled his shirt closed. In the dim, pulsating light of the embers, she saw it for the first time. A scar, long and puckered, ran down the left side of his chest, a silvery track that disappeared beneath his ribs. It was an old wound, half-healed and angry-looking, the unmistakable mark of a bullet. He had his own ghosts, his own history written on his body in pain and violence. He was not just the man who had taken the blame for a boy. He was a man who had been shot, who had survived something that should have killed him. They were not so different. Both of them were survivors, marked by the cruelty of other men. A fragile silence settled in the shack, broken only by the whisper of the wind outside. The terror had passed, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. He had seen the ugliest, most frightened part of her, and he had not run. He had offered her gentleness. He had offered her respect. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered the blanket. She shifted on the bunk, moving not away from him, but toward him. She leaned forward, her body trembling with the enormity of the gesture, and rested her forehead against his good shoulder. He went still, letting her come to him, keeping his promise. He did not put his arms around her. He simply sat there, a solid, warm presence in the dark, and let her lean on him. The warmth that flowed between them was not the desperate, animal heat they had shared against the killing cold of the blizzard. This was something else. It was comfort, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. And it was a confession, an unspoken admission that they were two broken souls who had found in each other a fragile, tentative reason to keep fighting. In the high, lonely dark of the mountain, it was the only warmth that mattered. Winter did not release its grip. It tightened it. The snow in the high country deepened, and the cold became a constant, biting presence, a third inhabitant of the tiny shack. The world beyond their rocky perch ceased to exist. They were suspended in a silent, white wilderness, their lives governed by the rising and setting of a pale, indifferent sun. Fear, which had been a wild, frantic thing, settled into a dull, constant ache. It was a beast that lived with them, but one they were learning not to look at directly. In the long, quiet hours, a new rhythm took root, a partnership born of necessity that slowly blossomed into something more. Their skills, one honed by a life of domestic confinement and the other by a life of open-range survival, became a currency they traded freely. Clara, with a patience that surprised even herself, taught Eli the simple arts of the needle and the stew pot. He would sit by the fire, his large, calloused hands, so adept with a rope or a revolver, struggling to push a fine needle through a patch on his worn shirt. He would scowl in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth, and she would watch the firelight play on his serious face, a small, unfamiliar smile touching her own lips. He learned to make their tough, stringy venison tender by slow simmering, to recognize the edible roots she found beneath the snow, to make a passable stew that tasted of warmth and perseverance. In return, he brought the wilderness to her. He took her outside into the blinding, silent cold and placed his Colt revolver in her hands. The gun felt alien, a heavy, cold weight of pure menace. She flinched from it, the memory of the violence that had shattered her life still raw. But Eli was a patient teacher. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. His hand would cover hers, his warmth seeping into her frozen fingers, his voice a low, steady murmur in her ear. "Do not fight it," he would say. "Just guide it." When she finally fired, the sound was a deafening crack that shattered the mountain's silence. The recoil jolted her arm, but the bullet struck a dead pine tree 20 yards away. A thrill, sharp and clean and utterly new, shot through her. It was the feeling of power, of agency. It was the feeling of not being a victim. He had managed to find his horse, Shadow, who had cleverly taken shelter in a thicket during the blizzard. He taught her to ride not as a passenger, but as a partner to the animal. He showed her how to move with the horse's gait, to read its moods, to guide it with a gentle pressure of the knees rather than a hard pull on the reins. On the back of the powerful animal, with the wind whipping her hair and the vast, empty wilderness spread below, Clara felt a sense of freedom she had never known. In these small, shared moments, the space between them filled not with silence, but with a quiet understanding. The fear was still there, a shadow at the edge of the firelight, But it was no longer the only thing they owned. One afternoon, as Eli was attempting to patch his trousers, he managed to sew the leg of the garment to his own sock. His cry of frustration, followed by the sight of him hopping around the tiny cabin with his foot attached to his knee, made a strange sound bubble up from Clara's chest. It was laughter, a real, unrestrained laugh that was rusty from disuse but full of life. He stopped his hopping and stared at her, his frustration melting away as he watched her. Then he began to laugh too, a deep, warm sound that made the whole cabin feel brighter. Their peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river, and they both knew it. The ice shattered one clear, cold morning. Eli was outside, checking a snare line, when he saw them, a line of dark figures on horseback, moving slowly through the valley below. They were ants against the vastness of the snow, but they moved with the grim purpose of predators. He did not need a spyglass to know who they were. One man rode at their head, a big man on a powerful black horse, a man who sat in his saddle with an air of arrogant ownership. Even from a mile away, Eli recognized the posture of Josiah Thorne. He moved back into the shack, his face a hard, grim mask. "They are here," he said, his voice flat. Clara came to his side, peering through a crack in the ill-fitting door. She saw the posse, a dark snake winding its way through the snow toward the place where her cabin stood. Her breath hitched. The laughter from yesterday felt like a memory from another lifetime. They watched in helpless silence from their high perch. They saw the men dismount and circle the small, silent cabin. It was an invasion, a violation of the only place she had ever called her own. Thorne was easy to spot. He moved with an angry, impatient stride, kicking at the door, shouting orders that were snatched away by the wind. They were too far to hear the words, but the fury was unmistakable. They saw the men find the tracks leading away from the cabin and up the mountain. A few of them pointed in their direction, but the tracks were old, covered with new dustings of snow, impossible to follow with any certainty. The hunters milled about in frustration. Thorne gestured wildly, his anger a palpable force even from a distance. Then they saw one of the men emerge from the cabin carrying a flaming brand from the hearth. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered, the word a prayer, a denial. They watched as Thorne took the brand and strode to the corner of the cabin. He held it to the dry, weathered logs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small orange flower of flame blossomed against the dark wood. It grew with a hungry speed, licking its way up the walls, black smoke beginning to curl against the pure white of the snow. The fire was mesmerizing in its terrible beauty. Flames shot through the roof, a roaring orange column against the pale blue sky. The structure that Thomas had built, the home where she had known both hope and despair, the refuge where she had saved Eli's life, was consumed. The posse watched for a time, their work done, then mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a burning pyre that sent a thick, greasy pillar of black smoke into the clean mountain air. Clara sank to her knees in the snow, her eyes fixed on the distant destruction. The smoke was a funeral plume for her life, for everything she had been. She had felt loss before, the sharp, hollow grief of her husband's death. This was different. This was an erasure. Eli knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder, wanting to offer comfort but knowing there was none to give. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a raw, cracked whisper, the sound of something breaking deep inside. "Everything I ever had, gone again." That night, the mood in the shack was as dark and cold as the star-dusted sky outside. The distant glow of the still smoldering embers in the valley was a constant, painful reminder of what they had lost. They sat in silence, the space between them filled with a heavy, unspoken dread. The hunters were gone for now, but they would be back. They were not the kind of men to give up. Eli finally broke the silence. his voice low and steady. "We can keep running. Clara, we can head north, through the mountains. It will be hard, but we can make it to Canada. No one would find us there. We could start over." He was offering her a future, a life of running and hiding, but a life nonetheless. A year ago, she might have taken it. A month ago, she might have considered it. But something inside her had changed. The woman who had cried in fear at her cabin door was not the same woman who now knew how to fire a gun, who had felt the thrill of her own strength. The fire had not just destroyed her past, it had burned away her last vestiges of victimhood. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the dying embers of their own small fire. "You cannot run forever, Eli, neither can I. I have been running my whole life, running from my father's temper, running from my husband's disappointments, running from the whispers in that town. I am done running." Her words were quiet, but they held the unbending certainty of solid rock. She was making a stand, not just against Thorne and his men, but against the fear that had dictated every choice she had ever made. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not disappointment, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. He knew what it was to be tired of running. The next day, the hunters returned. This time, they made camp in the valley, a cluster of flickering campfires that was clearly visible from the shack. They were settling in for a long hunt, preparing to sweep the mountain methodically come morning. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a siege. Later that night, when the moon was high and Clara was lost in a fitful, shallow sleep, Eli moved. He rose from his spot by the fire as silently as a shadow. He pulled on his coat and picked up his revolver, checking its load in the dim light. He looked at Clara, at her face softened by sleep but still etched with worry, and a look of profound resolution settled on his own features. He was going to walk down that mountain. He would surrender, draw them away from her, lead them on a chase in the opposite direction. He had taken the blame once to save a life he cared about. He would do it again. He was at the door, his hand on the crude wooden latch, when her voice stopped him, as quiet and sharp as the crack of a breaking twig in a frozen forest. "Do not—" He turned. She was sitting up on the bunk, the wolf hide pooled around her. Her eyes were wide and luminous in the darkness, and they held no trace of sleep. She had been watching him the whole time. "They will kill you, Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Or worse, if I draw them off, you will have a chance." "You think he will let me go?" she countered, her voice laced with a bitter irony. "Josiah Thorne, he is not hunting you for the bounty. Eli, he is hunting you because you are with me. He burned my home because I was not in it. This is not your fight. It is mine. I brought this on you," he insisted, his jaw tight with self-recrimination. She slid off the bunk and came to him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his face, her expression fierce and unwavering. She reached out and gently touched the stock of the revolver in his hand. "You gave up enough already," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "For that boy, you do not get to give up again, not for me." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her small hand closing over his larger one on the gun. "Let me fight beside you this time." It was not a plea, it was a declaration. In that moment, she was not a widow to be protected, a woman to be saved. She was his equal, a warrior staking her claim to her own life, to their shared fate. He looked down at her, at the raw courage shining in her eyes, and he knew she was right. To run, to surrender, would be to deny her the very thing he had come to admire most in her, her unbreakable spirit. He gave a slow, solemn nod. In the cold, dark hours before dawn, they prepared. There was no more talk. They moved with a shared, silent purpose. He showed her how to reload the revolver quickly, her fingers fumbling at first, then becoming sure and steady. They found an old, rust-pitted hunting rifle in the corner of the shack, with a handful of cartridges in a rotting leather pouch. They barricaded the door with the heavy wooden bunk. They checked the cracks in the walls, planning their lines of fire. Fear was a living thing in the small, dark room. It was a cold knot in Clara's stomach, a tight band around Eli's chest. It smelled of gun oil and old wood and the coming dawn. But they were not afraid alone. Their fear was a current that flowed between them, binding them together. A bond forged in the face of death that was closer, more profound than any vow ever spoken. They would face the morning together. Dawn arrived not as a gentle light, but as a cold, gray knife's edge that cut across the eastern peaks, laying bare the stark, frozen landscape. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the metallic smell of gun oil and a silence so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. Clara and Eli did not speak. They waited, their bodies tense, their senses stretched to a painful acuity. They had done all they could. The door was barred, the rifle was loaded, and the revolver lay on a small ledge near the window, its handle worn smooth by Eli's grip. The first sound was not a shout, but the soft, rhythmic crunch of snowshoes on frozen crust, a sound that grew steadily, deliberately closer. It was the sound of the world closing in. Then, a voice, laced with arrogant authority, cut through the morning stillness. It was Josiah Thorne. "Clara May," he called out, his voice unnervingly close. "I know you are in there. Send out the killer, and I will see to your safety. You have my word as a gentleman." The word a gentleman was a mockery, a piece of filth he threw at her door. Eli moved to the small crack in the wall they had been using as a peephole. He saw them, 5 of them, spreading out in a semicircle, their rifles held at the ready. Thorne stood in the center, a big, imposing figure, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat, his face red with cold and impatience. "He is no killer," Eli shouted back, his voice rough. "Ride out of here! Thorne! This is not your affair!" Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. "It became my affair when he took what was meant to be mine. You hear that, Clara? He has filled your head with lies. He is a wanted man, a fugitive who murdered his own boss. And you are a fool for hiding him. Now send him out, or we will burn this shack down just like we burned the last one." Clara moved to stand beside Eli, her own eye finding a crack in the logs. She saw Thorne's cruel, possessive eyes scanning the shack, and the last of her fear burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "You will have to kill us both." "Josiah," she called out, her voice clear and steady, a sound of defiance that seemed to startle the very air. A flicker of surprise, then pure fury, crossed Thorne's face. He had expected a frightened widow, a damsel to be rescued from the clutches of a villain. He had not expected this woman, this stranger with ice in her voice. "So be it," he snarled, and gave a sharp nod to his men. The world exploded in sound and violence. The first bullet tore through the wooden wall, a violent splintering that showered the inside of the shack with shards of frozen wood. Eli, who had been peering through the crack, jerked back with a sharp cry of pain, stumbling backward. A red line appeared on his temple, a shallow graze, but it bled freely, the blood a shocking crimson against his pale skin. For a heartbeat, Clara was frozen, the sight of his blood paralyzing her. Then, the training he had given her took over, the terror transmuted into pure, focused rage. She grabbed the heavy rifle, rested its barrel on the ledge, and took aim at the man who had fired, one of Thorne's hands who was reloading behind a tree. She remembered Eli's words, "Do not fight it, just guide it." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the sound a deafening roar in the small space. "Outside!" the man cried out, a sharp, surprised yelp, and fell clutching his leg, his rifle dropping into the snow. She had done it. She had shot a man. There was no time for horror, no time for regret. There was only the next breath, the next target. The canyon erupted into a full-scale gun battle. Gunfire echoed from the rock faces, a chaotic, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Puffs of gun smoke blossomed in the cold air, mingling with the fine, wind-blown snow until the world outside was a swirling vortex of white and gray. Bullets ripped through the shack's flimsy walls, punching holes that let in the blinding morning light and the bitter cold. Eli, shaking his head to clear it, was back at her side, firing the Colt with a calm, deadly efficiency. He did not fire wildly, but took careful, aimed shots, forcing the hunters to stay behind cover. They were a team, moving together in a deadly dance of survival. He would fire, and in the moment he took to reload, she would take a shot with the rifle, her movements becoming less hesitant, more certain with every pull of the trigger. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but their small, fortified position and their sheer desperation gave them an advantage. But Josiah Thorne was not a man to fight a battle of attrition. He was a predator who understood how to isolate the weakest prey. While his men kept them pinned down with a steady volley of fire, Thorne began to move, circling around the back of the shack, using the rocks and trees as cover, his movements silent and cunning. Clara sensed the shift before she saw it, a subtle change in the pattern of the gunfire, a feeling of being watched from a new direction. She turned just as the back wall of the shack groaned and then burst inward, a section of rotting logs giving way under Thorne's powerful assault. He stood there in the opening, a giant silhouette against the bright snow, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "You see, Clara," he sneered, taking a step into the shack. "There is nowhere you can hide. You always belonged to me." He lunged for her. The rifle was too long to bring to bear in the cramped space. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the knife at her belt, but he was too fast, too strong. He grabbed her, his fingers biting into the flesh of her arms like iron bands. A roar of pure, primal rage erupted from Eli's throat. He forgot his wound, forgot the men outside, forgot everything but the sight of Thorne's hands on Clara. He launched himself across the small room and tackled Thorne with the force of a maddened bull. The two men crashed together in a frenzy of violence. They were a tangle of limbs and fury, their grunts of effort and pain a brutal counterpoint to the gunfire outside. They smashed against the far wall, then rolled back across the floor, knocking over the last of their meager supplies. The fight was not one of skill. It was a raw, desperate struggle for dominance. A collision of two opposing forces, Thorne's possessive greed and Eli's protective fury. Their struggle carried them toward the opening Thorne had made, their boots scrabbling for purchase on the rough floorboards. They crashed through the opening and out into the snow, a single, flailing entity. They were on the edge of the rocky outcrop, a steep, snow-covered bank that dropped sharply down to the churning, half-frozen river below. For a moment they teetered on the precipice, locked in their deadly embrace. Then, with a final, desperate heave, they went over the edge, tumbling down the bank and vanishing with a great splash into the icy, gray water. The gunfire stopped. A sudden, ringing silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the rush of the river. The remaining hunters and Clara stared, frozen, at the spot where the two men had disappeared. For Clara, the world seemed to slow down, to mute. The cold, the danger, the men outside, it all faded away. There was only the river, and Eli. She did not make a conscious decision. Her body moved before her mind could protest, before the cold logic of survival could tell her it was suicide. She ran out of the shack, past the stunned faces of the bounty hunters, and launched herself over the edge of the bank, sliding down the snow and plunging into the lethal, shocking cold of the river. The cold was a physical blow. It stole her breath, paralyzed her muscles, and sent 1,000 icy needles into her skin. The current was a powerful, unseen hand that grabbed her and tried to pull her under, to drag her downstream with the chunks of ice that littered the surface. For a terrifying moment, she was utterly lost, tumbling in the dark. churning water. Then her head broke the surface. She gasped, her lungs screaming for air. She saw him. Eli was a few yards away, his head barely above water, his body limp. He was being carried by the current, his strength gone, further downstream. She saw Thorne's head for a moment, his mouth open in a silent cry, before a large chunk of ice struck him and he disappeared beneath the surface. He did not come back up. Clara fought the river with a desperate, animal strength she did not know she possessed. She swam for Eli, her arms and legs numb, her movements clumsy and weak. She was a creature of pure will, a single thought burning in her mind. Save him. She reached him, grabbing a handful of his wet coat. He was a dead weight, his eyes closed, his face a ghastly, bluish white. She hooked her arm around his chest and began the agonizing fight to get to the shore. The current was relentless, but she was more so. She kicked, she pulled, she clawed her way through the water, her vision blurring, her body screaming for release. Finally, her feet struck gravel. She had found a shallow spot, a small cove protected from the main force of the current. With the last of her strength, she dragged Eli out of the water and onto the frozen bank, collapsing beside him, her body shaking so violently she felt her bones might rattle apart. The other hunters were gone. Seeing their leader vanish and witnessing her mad plunge into the river had broken their nerve. They had taken their wounded man and fled, leaving the mountain to its silence once more. Clara pushed herself up. Eli was not moving. His lips were blue, his skin the color of marble. She put her ear to his chest and heard the faintest, most fragile flutter of a heartbeat. He was alive, but the river was still trying to kill him, its icy chill clinging to him, pulling the life out of him. She looked around wildly. Shelter. They needed shelter. A short distance away, nestled at the base of the rock face, was a dark opening, a small cave, hollowed out by wind and water. It was not much, but it was their only hope. She half dragged, half carried him to the cave, her own frozen body a clumsy, uncooperative machine. Inside, it was dark and damp, but it was out of the wind. She gently laid him down on the cold, stone floor. His clothes were a sheet of ice, and she knew they had to come off. Her own fingers were numb and useless, but she forced them to work, fumbling with the buttons of his shirt, the buckle of his belt. She peeled the freezing wet layers from his body until he was bare-chested. His skin was so cold it felt like death itself. The scar on his chest was a pale, livid line. She stripped off her own wet coat and blouse, her own skin instantly rebelling against the frigid air. Shivering uncontrollably, she lay down beside him, pressing the length of her body against his, skin to skin, her arms wrapping around his torso, her hands flat against his bare chest. She was trying to force her own life, her own meager warmth, into his frozen form. The cave was filled with the sound of the wind outside and the harsh, chattering sound of her own teeth. She held him tighter, her cheek pressed against his cold shoulder, her body a desperate, living furnace. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, her warm breath misting in the cold air. "Please, Eli, stay with me." It was more than an act of survival. In that dark, desperate cave, as she held his life in her hands, she was making a promise. It was a vow unspoken, a raw and human contract born of shared loss and desperate need. She had pulled him from the snow, and now she would pull him from the grip of the river. She would not let the world take another thing from her. She would not let it take him. She held him through the long, dark hours, her own shivering eventually subsiding as their bodies created a fragile pocket of warmth. She did not sleep. She listened to the sound of his heart, a slow, thready beat that was her only guide. She felt for his breath against her hair, a faint, almost imperceptible stir of air, and she waited. Dawn came again, a thin, gray light that crept into the mouth of the cave. It found them entwined on the stone floor, two survivors clinging to the edge of the world, She felt a stir against her, a flicker of his eyelids. She pulled back slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. His eyes, hazy and unfocused at first, opened. They found her face, and a flicker of recognition, of understanding, softened their gaze. His lips moved, and a sound, barely a whisper, emerged. "You warmed me," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle. He took a shallow, painful breath, his gaze holding hers. "More than I deserved." Tears she did not know she had left to cry welled in her eyes and traced hot paths down her cold cheeks. He was alive, and in the first light of a new day, in a cold and empty cave. That was everything. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a fighter, battling winter for every inch of ground. The thaw was a slow, arduous process. For weeks, the world was a messy churn of melting snow and sodden earth. The river, swollen and brown, raged with the memory of its icy fury, carrying the last of the winter's debris downstream. Then, one morning, the air held a new scent, a deep, loamy fragrance of soil waking from a long sleep. Green shoots, impossibly vibrant, pushed their way through the last patches of snow along the riverbank. The world was breathing again. They had survived. The days in the cave after the fight had been a blur of fever and shivering, a slow crawl back to life. Eli's recovery was hard, his body ravaged by the cold and his wounds. But Clara's will was a fire that would not let him go. She nursed him with fierce tenderness, using the last of their supplies and her knowledge of herbs to pull him back from the brink. One day, from a high vantage point, Eli saw a party of lawmen from the next county seat ride into the valley. They spent a day dragging the river. They found the body of Josiah Thorne, and later, downstream, the bodies of 2 of his men, including the one Clara had shot. The official story, which eventually trickled back to them through the loose talk of a lone trapper passing through, was simple and clean. A dispute among bounty hunters. A fugitive cowboy and a rancher had killed each other and been washed away by the river. The case was closed. Eli was officially dead. The news settled over them not with triumph, but with a profound, quiet relief. The ghost that had been hunting him was finally laid to rest. They did not leave the valley, this small patch of land, which had seen so much of her sorrow and their struggle, was theirs now, consecrated by fire and blood. They moved from the cave back down to the blackened ruins of her cabin. The sight of the charred logs, the twisted metal of the stove, the single defiant stone chimney pointing to the sky, was a fresh wound. But it was not an end, it was a foundation. Together, they began to rebuild, using the salvageable timber and felling new pines from the woods. They constructed a new cabin. It was smaller than the first, sturdier, with thick walls and a tight roof designed to withstand the worst of the mountain's fury. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence, their movements synchronized. He would notch the logs with powerful, precise swings of his axe, and she would be there to help him lever them into place, her small frame surprisingly strong. They cleared a patch of land near the riverbank, turning over the rich, dark soil. Clara planted the seeds she had managed to save, beans, squash, and corn. The simple, hopeful act of pushing a seed into the earth and trusting it to grow felt like the most courageous thing she had ever done. It was an act of faith in a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. Eli, in turn, began to build a corral. He still had Shadow, and over the weeks, he managed to capture 2 wild mares from a small herd that roamed the valley. He had a gentle, patient way with the animals, a quiet authority that calmed their wildness without breaking their spirit. Watching him work with the horses, his voice a low murmur, his hands firm but kind, Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. Their life was spare, stripped down to the rhythms of the earth. They woke with the sun and slept when darkness fell, Their days were filled with the hard, satisfying work of building a life from nothing. They were no longer just survivors. They were pioneers in the wilderness of their own making. But the scars remained, pale and puckered on the surface of their new life. Peace was a guest in their home, not a permanent resident. Sometimes, Clara would be stirring a pot over the fire, and the sudden clatter of a dropped spoon would send a jolt of ice through her veins. For a terrible, disorienting second, she would be back in the old cabin, her body tensed for the inevitable explosion of Thomas's whiskey-fueled anger. She would catch her breath, her heart hammering, and then the fear would recede as she looked up and saw Eli, his presence a calm, steady anchor in the present. He never asked what ghosts she saw in those moments. He would simply meet her eyes, his gaze full of a quiet understanding, and the ghosts would retreat. Eli carried his own phantoms. He had the ingrained caution of a hunted man. A sudden noise in the woods, a snapping twig, the cry of a hawk, would make him go still, his hand drifting instinctively toward the Colt that was now always holstered at his hip. The fear was a part of him, a coiled spring of readiness that might never fully unwind. He was a dead man, free from the law, but his body had not yet forgotten the feeling of being prey. One afternoon in late summer, as the valley was lush and green, they had an unexpected visitor. Reverend Miller came riding up the path, his face a mask of stern disapproval as he took in the sight of their small, thriving homestead. He looked at the sturdy cabin, the neat rows of corn, the horses in the corral, and his expression only hardened. He saw not perseverance, but sin. He dismounted, refusing Eli's quiet offer of water. His business was with Clara alone. Eli gave a slight nod to Clara and moved away, busying himself with a piece of tack near the corral, giving them the illusion of privacy but staying close enough to be a silent, watchful presence. "Clara May," the preacher began, his voice oozing a practiced piety, "the town has been praying for you. We believed you had perished. To find you here, living in this arrangement." He let his gaze drift pointedly toward Eli. "It is an affront to your late husband's memory and to the laws of God." Clara said nothing, simply waiting, her hands folded before her. The woman who once trembled before this man was gone. "However," he continued, adopting a more magnanimous tone, "the good people of Prospect's Hope are forgiving. Mr. Thorne's passing was a tragedy, but his affairs are being settled. Your husband's debts are cleared. The town is willing to welcome you back. You have been forgiven for your lapse in judgment." "My lapse in judgment?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Associating with a known fugitive, a man of violence," the preacher clarified, waving a dismissive hand toward Eli. "Leave this man. Come back to the fold. You can have a respectable life again. This is your chance for salvation. Clara, cast out the sinner and be welcomed back into the light." He spoke as if she were a lost child, as if he were offering her the greatest gift in the world. He truly believed it. He saw her life here as a fall from grace, and he was the righteous hand reaching down to pull her out of the muck. For a long moment, Clara was silent. Then, a soft, low sound escaped her lips. It was a laugh. It was not the full, joyous laugh she had shared with Eli, but a small, sad, knowing sound, full of a pity that was directed entirely at the man standing before her. The preacher recoiled, his face flushing with indignation. "This is no laughing matter, woman." "No," she agreed, her laughter dying, her gaze clear and direct. "It is not." She looked past him, at the mountains that stood guard over their valley, at the small, strong cabin they had built with their own hands, at the quiet man who had shown her the meaning of gentleness. She looked at the world she had chosen, the life she had fought for. Then she looked back at the preacher, at his world of judgment and whispers and conditional forgiveness. "I already left the world that needed forgiving," she said softly. The words were a final, quiet dismissal. Reverend Miller stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no more words came. He had come to offer salvation and had found himself facing a woman who had already saved herself. Defeated. He climbed back onto his horse and rode away without another word, a black-clad specter of a world that no longer had any power over her. As autumn approached, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. Storms would sometimes roll in from the north, great magnificent displays of lightning and thunder that reminded them of the blizzard that had forged their bond. One evening, such a storm swept over the valley. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind whipped through the pines, carrying the clean, sharp scent of rain. Clara stood outside the cabin, her face turned up to the tumultuous sky, watching as brilliant forks of lightning illuminated the distant peaks. She was not afraid. The storm was wild and beautiful, a reflection of the wilderness that was now in her own heart. The cabin door opened, and Eli came to stand beside her. He did not speak, but simply watched the storm with her. In his hands, he carried the old wolf's hide. He unfolded it and wrapped it around both of their shoulders, pulling her close against his side. The fur was worn and familiar, a cloak of shared memory, of survival. He leaned his head close to hers, his voice a low rumble against the sound of the rising wind. "We do not owe them anything," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a creed for the nation of two they had founded in this valley. She leaned her head against his chest, her hand coming to rest over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that was as real and as constant as the mountain they stood upon. This was the truth. Not the judgment of preachers or the gossip of towns, this solid living warmth, this quiet strength beside her. Their survival was not a grand, heroic triumph shouted from the mountaintops. It was a quiet, stubborn endurance. They were two broken souls, scarred by the world and the people in it. They had been judged and found wanting, cast out and left for dead. But in the coldest, darkest corner of their lives, they had found each other. They had chosen to create their own warmth rather than curse the world for its cold. The first drops of rain began to fall, cool and heavy on their faces. The storm broke over them, washing the air clean, as the downpour softened to a gentle mist. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face, illuminated by a final, distant flash of lightning, was calm, his eyes full of a deep, abiding tenderness that was reserved only for her. She whispered the words that had been the seed of it all, the question that had started not as a plea for love, but for life. But the meaning had changed. It had grown with the seeds in their garden, strengthened with every log they had laid, and been tempered in the fire of their final battle. "I'll warm you, if you let me." And this time, it was not mercy, it was love. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.